So now for this next session, to find out more about regulatory and political risk, how investors and operators can best factor these risks into their plans, please welcome back Max.
Thank you.
Over to you.
Thanks very much, guys. Great. Hi, hello. And we've got a great panel. We have Sharon Lamb from McDermott. And we have Stefan Rao, also from McDermott, who's going to be joining us virtually. And last but by no means least, we've got Joe Ryan, who is the finance director of Medicover. Joe was telling me earlier that when he joined Medicover 25 years ago as finance director, its first year turnover was under $1 million. Mm-hmm. And what's the turnover today?
This year will probably be in excess of 1.3 billion euros.
1.3 billion euros. Okay. So he has seen a lot of regulatory and political risk in his time. So we're going to start with a short presentation from Sharon, with Stefan as well, chipping in from Germany. There is Stefan. Hello, Stefan. Hi.
Hi. Hello to everyone.
Stefan was going to be here in person, but he had a problem with the UK vaccination rules. You're in tomorrow, aren't you, Stefan? Yes.
I hope so, yeah. Well,
Okay,
I
excellent.
am vaccinated, but anyway.
I'm sure you're entirely safe, Stefan.
I'll that in person tomorrow.
Okay, great. Okay, Sharon, over to you then.
Do I just...
Oh, and I should say before I start, McDermott has done this great report on political risk and regulatory and legal changes, and these slides are from that report. That report you will find now on the app to download. So over to you, Sharon.
So hello, good morning, really nice to be here. I'm a healthcare partner at McDermott London office with my colleague behind me, not behind me now, Stefan Rao, who's in our Munich office, and together we work on transactions and on regulatory issues for health providers and providers into the health sector. Every year we produce an annual report looking at changes in legal and regulatory risk, and the section of the report that's been put onto the app is our forward-looking part. So what do we expect to affect transactions and investment into healthcare into 2022? And that's us. There's a lot of detail in the report, but this is a kind of overview of some of the key changes and issues that we've identified from our work in Europe and from our partner firms who work with us. And unsurprisingly, the impact of COVID still looms very large in regulatory terms across all sectors. And that's probably unsurprising, but what is surprising is that it isn't a feature for every country. Looking at the UK, for example, where we have such a significant backlog of care, as of July this year, there had been 26 million fewer outpatient appointments than the period before, and more than 5.6 million people still waiting for care, with the highest waiters for care for over a year since records began. So the pressures as a consequence of COVID in the UK probably loom large on the political and regulatory kind of horizon, and that affects how we perceive some of the other changes that are likely to be coming into the UK, which I'll come into in a minute. A key thing about when we look across Europe to kind of identify areas that are going to be more risky, less risky, which areas look safe, is that what is interesting is, of course, that healthcare is so exceedingly national. What influences the regulation, the legislation, and the investment risk is really often a feature of what has captured the public's attention and what the political parties of the time may or may not think is a priority for their voters. And so that really kind of influences, I suppose, that on this slide we have so many different features drawn from so many different countries, so that it can be quite difficult to draw out some kind of key themes, slightly like, guessing for each country. But what does that mean ultimately? And I think this might be a point that we come on to later, because even though you can have aspirational governments wanting to change, the involvement of the private sector, wanting to heavily regulate or deregulate, as in the UK, I'll come on to in a minute, ultimately what really seems to affect the transaction cycle and the investment risk is the underlying demand for care and the ability of governments to fund that or not fund that. And that is a crucial element, I think, that we have to balance against what might be aspirational legislative and regulatory changes. And in the next thing I think is after COVID, and I think COVID really demonstrates this, we're looming large over the horizon, kind of a wide changes on medical device regulatory, which will affect the costs of provision, and similarly foreign investment control. Now we saw this, the foreign investment control regimes introduced or proposed to be introduced, first in 2019, 2020, and then of course as the vaccine and kind of concerns about PPE, we saw governments kind of really heavily kind of say, well, we're going to protect our own kind of borders and the investments into our kind of strategic assets. But as those regimes have hit the kind of legislative timetable, we've seen them narrowed back. So significantly narrowed back into artificial intelligence, pharmaceuticals, and biotechnologies. So a typical example, say, and the UK is not alone in this, we started off with it looking like healthcare services would be regulated by our foreign investment control, and we've ended up with a very narrow definition on biotechnology and artificial intelligence. And so I'll just move then onto, I'll just see Stefan. We'll pick up some of the kind of key themes that we've identified in each of the countries. We won't look at each of them at all. Far too much time, far too much interesting detail. Max has warned me against interesting detail. But of course, we're delighted to pick up anything separately. I'll just see. Looking at the key themes here, I'm going to cover the UK, and then I'll, Stefan, of course, will be interested to tell you about the German political changes during this week, or maybe during the next few months, depending on the coalition government. And as I've said to you, COVID-19 has really affected significantly, first, the public affection for the NHS. Those of you who have been in the UK through COVID will have seen We Love Our NHS, NHS rainbows in windows, We Love Our NHS staff, really cementing the NHS as a pillar of religion in this country. But at the same time, we are clearly under some kind of significant constraint on public resource. And so that interestingly brings me on to what will be, or appears to be, a very significant shift in the NHS or the public sector landscape. We have one of the largest pieces of legislation coming through in the NHS, reconfiguring entirely the customer and purchaser of NHS services, and accompanied by a procurement regime which on the face of it looks to be kind of endorsing not an anti-private sector, but a liberalization and flexibility for NHS customers to choose who they contract with without having to follow procurement regimes. Now I say, we come back to the original comment of it's, on the face of it, those changes in procurement look extremely concerning, or they could look very beneficial if you have a very good relationship with your customer and your customer is happy to continue contracting with you. The rules will allow for significant flexibility. And ultimately, these legislative changes were introduced by a kind of we'll protect the NHS. That was the background to them. We'll introduce integrated care. We'll minimize the role of the private sector. Yet at the beginning of my kind of little presentation, I said, well, all of this is well and good, but with 6 million people also waiting for care, with significant headline pressure on waiting times, what that ultimately means is that if there is a reduction in the use of the private sector providers are reporting huge increases in self-pay and PMI revenue. And the balancing here is ultimately kind of borne out by, well, where does the money go when those headlines are rising and when people are desperate for their own care? I'll hand over to Stefan now, quickly. See around.
Ah, there he is.
Hi. Yeah, thank you, Sharon. Um, as of, the items that we identified for Germany like some weeks ago are probably not really the most pressing one now. Foreign investment control, Sharon, you mentioned it, each country is kind of um, strengthening its foreign investment control regime. Large health systems, large hospitals are now also subject to foreign investment control. However, that only really applies to the very, very large hospitals, which are not for sale anyway. And it does apply to pharma and med device companies. But even there, I would not expect any vetoes by the government. If you look at the history of German foreign investment control, there have been very, very, very few vetoes. I'm aware of two against any investment, and never has that been an a case where a Western company invested into Germany. So therefore, I think the entire foreign investment control is a lot of political saying, but fortunately, so far, it does not have any practical relevance. It might, in some cases, delay proceedings, but again, very unlikely in the health services sector. I think there's a backlog with my voice. It's okay, or
Yeah.
you hear me well?
Hello?
Yeah,
Can you hear
okay.
me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me well?
Yeah, we can hear you. Yes,
Okay.
yes, yes.
Okay,
You're having
okay.
a moment of paranoia, but we can hear you clearly.
Although I was very relaxed about foreign investment control.
Yes.
Well, the second item that we referred to was whistleblowing. That applies to all European countries. Most people will know there's a European directive which needs to be implemented within 2 years, where under each company is kind of obliged to develop a structure where under whistleblowing is incentivized, where employees are incentivized to make to report any issues that they see that might be a basis of fraud or even corruption. And obviously, the law, the directive, or also the pending law, draft laws provide that these employees shall be protected from any sanctions by the employer. Not really something that is peculiar to healthcare, but it could obviously be applicable there. But anyway, that is going to be the case in each EU country. No idea whether you have that in UK, Sharon, but I think we need to focus on that any further. The IT security guidelines is something that is applicable to outpatient health service providers, to clinics, to small doctors' practices, but also to huge outpatient entities and clinical labs like Joe's entities in Germany. So I assume Joe is already looking for some IT guys who shall implement the IT security guideline. And I'm sure he's going to love to talk on this topic to us. Clinical trials, not really, again, just the implementation of the European directives. And supply chain, obviously also a very political issue. A draft law has been suggested, it is going to be kind of resolved by the next government, whatever, or the parliament on the next government, whatever the government shall be. Basically, it sets out some duties of care for large companies with the purpose of respecting human rights, ecological standards, and to in some cases hinder companies to buy from those sources. Now, I would like to come to the issue that is really important, and that is obviously the pending general elections. As you know, Germany currently has a center government, with Angela Merkel being a center politician coming from a center-right party. Her coalition partner, the Social Democrats, are a center-left party. And it's all very much to the center, and probably that has not really been bad for our country. Most people think that has been quite successful, but maybe also a bit boring. Now, political discussions are not that boring. We have ecological issues, climate protection as by far the main topic in the election campaign. each party, except for the very far right, agree that measures need to be taken to improve climate and to protect climate, and particularly to reduce CO emission. Only the ways are controversial, and like always, it's probably a mixture of different concepts: incentivize new technology developments, or to implement further regulation. At any rate, that is on everyone's heads, and that's the main issue. How, as a consequence thereof, it appears that the parties of the left political spectrum are going to increase dramatically, particularly the Social Democrats and the Greens, which are very likely to form the next government. However, it is also likely that they're not going to have a majority on their own. And there's I would say a 50% likelihood that if these two parties govern, which is not sure, but which appears very likely, they will either form a coalition with the Liberals, which is a market-oriented civil rights party, or with the very left-leaning party, which is the sister party of Podemos in Spain, and actually the successor party of the former communists in the GDR. And the electorate of that party is also quite diverse. You still have the former GDR nomenclatura. Obviously, they are diminishing, and some of them are now voting for the very far right. But also, you have young, hip guys, very left-leaning, very socialist, very, very good world thinking. And these two groups form a small party, which is also has very good chances to be part of the government. If they become a member of the new government, then I would assume, and there are already plans existing, that it's very likely that the health department might be led by a politician of that party. What would that mean? We don't know. The Greens and the Reds had for 20 or 30 years on the political agenda the objective to have a more universal health system. However, when they were governing the country, they did not implement it. So it is totally unclear whether they're going to do it. What am I talking about? I'm talking about the fact that in Germany, we do not have a universal health system like the NHS. 90% of the population are covered by public payers in the outpatient sector, 85% in the inpatient sector, and 15% of the population are covered by private payers. These private payers, private insurances, representing 10 or 15% of the population, account for about 37% of the market in terms of payments. That means that if these private insurance system shall be prohibited, which is unlikely, but which is on the agenda, or which should only be additional to public payer system, that the entire German health system would probably face very severe financial challenges, which is a reason why I do not believe that this is going to happen. However, it is on the agenda. And as you might remember from the last red-green government that we had from 1998 to 2005, they started with discussing nationalizations of banks. The growth rates were the lowest in Europe. The Economist was describing Germany as the sick man of Europe. However, at the end of the term of this government, the most decisive economic and social reforms were established, which were also a basis for the economic success later.
Thanks.
So to summarize,
thanks very much, Stefan. That's fantastic. Okay, so wrapping it up. The future looks very, very murky, but we're not. Yes, it's not clear what would actually happen. We can discuss that more in the Q&A, can't we? Sharon, over to you again.
What I'm proposing to do is I won't go through the rest of the countries. I think we'll pick them up as we are speaking in our panel discussion. The only thing I'll make as an observation, of course, are two further observations, kind of the huge adoption of digital health and a loosening of telemedicine throughout Europe, particularly in France, and the impact, and we can come on to this when we speak about political and regulatory changes in the UK, the proposals of the UK government to significantly deregulate medical devices, medicines, and consultation regimes on data and health data issued last week. We can discuss how likely or what the impact of those might be in our discussions.
And the second point?
And that was it, telemedicine, and you go.
Well,
And
thank you very much. Thanks, Sharon. So that's really useful. It's interesting to see how, how comprehensively you're covering all of these themes in every country. We've got slides there for Poland and I think Denmark, Netherlands, Italy. Fantastic. So, Joe, let me just come briefly to you. I mean, you Medicover is active in Germany. You're active in Poland, Romania. You've got a big business in Ukraine, and you're also in India. So you span everything from sort of the first world, rich first world, through to emerging middle-income countries, and through to India. What's your experience been on what's your attitude towards regulatory and political risk in general as a finance director?
I think in terms of investing in healthcare, then you need to accept that there's a risk there, and you need to be able to understand it and all the different things the corollaries that flow from it. So surprisingly, when I started 25 years ago, one of the easier things was that investing in Eastern Europe, that there's similarity in terms of the regulatory regime, because they all came out of copied out from Moscow. So in fact, actually, I'd say that to some degree, investing in real developing markets is actually easier than some of the Western markets where their own different flavors of regulation are developed. So certainly, if I look at the markets where we're operating, then Germany is by far the most regulatory orientated. And then you need to understand the difference in the flavors and what it means. I had conversations with people who investors who don't really understand that actually fundamentally how regulatory systems differ between, say, Germany and Poland. So it's such a rules-based and legal interpretation-based out of Germany, where fundamental problems can...
So you've seen financial investors just get that wrong. Have you got an example?
You only get it when you've been through the mill for so many years, like Stefan. I worked with Stefan 18 years ago, I think, first started working with him. And so unless you've been through that mill of dealing with that and understanding it at a fundamental level, then you can impose your own sort of concepts on top of it. And at some level, it is similar. But those differences are the ones that go to the bottom of it. So unless you've got people who really got experience in it, and you can set yourself up for
because you were talking about a small hospital you nearly acquired, weren't you? And that actually you realised just didn't deliver.
Our businesses in Germany has been through 3 different iterations of how you can be a foreigner and how you can be a financial investor and own businesses. And the last one is and it won't be the last one, is the hospitals. And so we were in a situation where we relaxed, take our time to buy a hospital. So we looked at a lot of them. And one I remember was fantastic deal, wonderful concept, lovely hospital. Fundamentally, some of the founding documents were wrong. And that you can never correct. And so it completely defeated the whole purpose. We walked away, thank you very much. 3 months later, bought by a financial investor to found their multi-million investments in Germany. They didn't get it, that there was a fundamental issue.
That illustrates the dangers of that, doesn't it, really? And how do you feel about, you have invested in markets which were seen to be politically risky, like Poland or, Ukraine in particular. Most of the people in this room wouldn't dream of investing in Ukraine.
Well, we know about political risk, that's for sure. We know about war risk because we lost our business in Crimea, annexed. And when I even went and we're investing in healthcare, population, central thing, not covered by sanctions. You go, you ask for permission. Can we invest from your regulatory regime in Europe? And they say, oh, no, there's Crimea. Yeah, but it's exempt. It's okay. You can give us the okay. You can give us the authority to invest there. And they said, no, we're not going to do it. It's just politically, we're not going to do it. So then I have to sell. And then you have to get out, and even getting the money out is impossible. I talked to my bankers, and they said, "Oh, we got this money in Crimea." I said, forget it, no way, go away.
And yet Ukraine itself has been one of your most profitable, fastest growing
Fundamentally, you
businesses.
have markets where you have needs of healthcare, where you have poor provision, and you have organisation provision, and you can fit within the regulatory regime, and you always, as a foreign investor, need to be whiter than white. And it works. You have demand, you have people who can pay, and if you can service a good quality, then you will have a market. And some of those markets are better than some of the other more regulated ones with slower growth.
So you'd say regulatory and political risk overall is possibly larger in Germany than in Poland or Ukraine?
Yeah, I'd say so, fundamentally, because the whole concept of how the regulatory regime comes from a different, completely legal concept and way of looking at it. Yeah.
Right. Would you agree, Sharon? I mean, that's a radical claim, isn't it? That
Well-
emerging markets are actually there's less regulatory risk, political risk in emerging markets than in
think-
Germany.
Well, I wouldn't want to make a sweeping statement, and I'll obviously leave Germany to Stefan. But I think the issue with highly regulated markets, France, the UK, Germany, and others, going to rapidly put Spain, the Netherlands, kind of the Swiss countries in that category, is that as political issues have evolved, so the regulation has kind of been put in place to match it. So it makes it a little bit less free, whereas in emerging countries you have obviously you have the wider political risk, but you have a looser regulatory system. So
Yes.
there's more flexibility, there's more appetite for that risk, but you've got to bear in mind the wider political framework within which you're investing there.
Yes. So
It's clearly, will be very interesting to see where the UK ends up with the proposed liberalisation of regulation. We've had some kind of wildly optimistic statements around the liberalisation for life sciences, statements on medical devices, sharing of NHS data to promote research. Ultimately, that type of liberalisation, if proposed, really needs to be in a system where you've got reimbursement for that type of investment. So if you've got a public system which is pretty constrained and there isn't a significant reimbursement, or it's kind of cheapest place for medicines and medical devices, does it matter that you have a liberalised single unit country for regulatory affairs?
yes.
I see we've got a question here on...
Yes. So, yes. So the question is: have the UK seen some high-profile issues around procurement? This is from our app. Has seen some high-profile issues around procurement and supplier connections to government ministers. Has this been repeated elsewhere? What do you expect to be the regulatory consequences? In other words, he's referring here to the view that that various ministers have been linked into friends who've won large contracts off the back of being friends of the government. And has that been repeated? Has that been repeated elsewhere in Europe?
Interestingly, it hasn't been or reported as repeated elsewhere. It seems to have been quite a UK-specific issue, possibly because the procurements in Europe, whilst initially criticised for being slow, were led by the European Commission and were on a kind of European-wide basis.
They didn't cut corners.
So originally they were kind of criticised, oh, look, the UK's gone fast, broken things, got things in place, whereas slow and steady appears to have won this race. And it's an interesting point where we are on those contracts. The government, of course, has an overwhelming majority, the Conservative government. It has promised, and you won't be surprised to learn that lawyers and others, eagerly expecting the mother of all inquiries into COVID-19. And they've promised that in this government. Whether or not that happens and the timing for any next election will be crucial.
I think it will be kicked into the law.
Yeah. So is it? Or there are kind of two schools of thought. Will they hold the inquiry early on to give some kind of lead time into a next election? Or will it be kind of parceled up into bits and pieces so that there are other priorities, so it just gets forgotten? And interestingly, around at the end of 2020, the UK published, so just at the end of kind of just as we were leaving the European Union, start of Brexit, they published a procurement framework. It obviously came from some scars from Brexit about using emergency powers. And it proposed what many lawyers have said to be a highly opaque regime, no transparency, very difficult to sue, very difficult to litigate if there were poor awards of contracts. That came out kind of end of December 2020, then followed by the trade agreement, which contradicted some of the proposals. And really, we've seen very little else, and we're in September 2021. And so I think it might be a highly political thing to bring in a piece of procurement legislation that allows for fast and immediate awards with very little ability to challenge. And I think that's the reason we haven't seen anything else. We were expecting it at the beginning of the opening of Parliament now.
But we haven't seen it.
We haven't seen it. So,
Are there any questions from the audience? We've got any questions? Dying to ask a question? Not just now, but I'll let you cook on that question and think about questions. It's very interesting looking at Poland, isn't it, and about the kind of handbrake turns there have been. Because everyone assumed when PiS took power that they would, they're very anti the private sector, weren't they? And then, I talked to a lab operator who said everything was being, at the start of COVID, everything was being expropriated at the border. They bring in stuff and it would be expropriated at the border and handed to the NHS. And they got to the stage where they were actually saying, well, let's try and, can we close down all our labs? Can we sack all our people? How easy is it going to be to extract ourselves? And then by June, July, you had all these massive partnerships forming and now they're talking about private-public partnerships, are they, Joe? Or, what's your take on this?
PiS have always been actually quite pragmatic about when it comes to real solutions. So what you see removed and what you see on the ground are the views are completely different. Because ultimately, what do they need to do, like any public body? They need to deliver healthcare because the people who consume it are their voters, and that's what they want to do. And the private providers are an essential part of the infrastructure for Poland, whether any political party likes it or not. That's part of the solution because that's how it is structured. Whole sectors of the provision model are privately owned. So you have to live with it. You have the politics at the higher level in terms of the image that public good, private bad, and so they have to play that game. But ultimately, at the operator level, it's about providing the healthcare, and they've done fantastic stuff in terms of improvements that actually really channel correctly the right type of focus in terms of how you deliver a broader care continuum. Take, for instance, maternity. They have a fantastic scheme in terms of making sure that the process starts from beginning to end, financially incentivized, whoever you are, public or private, and it has a good result.
I bet 2 years ago, if I'd asked you what the impact of PiS was going to be, you would have been. You weren't particularly impressed by it.
No, because then there was a lot of rhetoric. But in terms of how it's come out, then I think it's
good.
Well. And there were certain players who maybe were abusing the system that got punished. But is that necessarily a bad thing if you're abusing?
No.
Because ultimately, the only way you make it work is being in a partnership. I know public partnership. People forget about that partnership, but it is a partnership. You've got to provide the care. You've got to be a partner which is valuable to the public system.
It seems to be a theme, doesn't it, that in certain countries where you've got decentralized healthcare, like Italy, Sweden, as well as Poland, the attitude of the local politician is very different from the attitude at the centre. I know that's true in Sweden, for example. The Social Democrats on the ground have always been very pragmatic, whereas at a central level, maybe less so, more dogmatic sometimes. But and in Italy as well, isn't it? That kind of, you get that kind of.
I think a lot of it comes actually from the reimbursement model, which drives the whole mechanics of how things work. So in Germany, where you have a system of reimbursement which is totally divorced from your ownership structure, then the ownership becomes a completely secondary question. It's just regulatory from a point of view of control of how healthcare is provided versus a budgetary system in Sweden with large levels of devolution, but it's a budgetary-based system, block budget for care. and then what how much care there is in terms of volume is they're not interested in.
Yes, yes. Well, Stefan, how do you see this then? I mean, has that also been true in Germany, that you've got much more pragmatism at the local
Yes.
level? You have, haven't you?
Yes, obviously, and as Jill was saying, the regulatory risk might be higher in a more developed democracy than in other countries, and that might have stronger financial impact to Medicover, to the positive and to the negative, I would think. But in general, each government wants to have good healthcare for their population. This is obviously very important. We have not seen this only during COVID times. We've seen this before. And sometimes you can also say that in Germany, it has actually been the more left-leaning government that was incentivizing financial investors and attracting financial investors into the country, because they knew that it is important to have money in the system and to have financial investors who are willing to make these investments. Doctors usually do not vote for the Social Democrats either. Therefore, they do not need to represent the doctors' objectives, doctors' whatever views on financial investors. Therefore, it's often more the allegedly more market-oriented parties that have introduced market entry barriers, additional market entry barriers for financial investors.
Yes.
Therefore, all say that we have as to will there be more restrictions for financial investors if we have a more left-leaning government? I doubt it.
You doubt it. But we're not, I mean, we obviously saw a lot of privatization of hospitals in Germany, some time ago now, but I mean, that privatization boom has completely stopped, hasn't it? It's now seen
It
as
has.
only a bad word. You wouldn't see, would you expect any more of those at all in the next, even if the left wing, or do you think you might see those or not?
Well, actually, it is. It has particularly been the left-leaning communities in East Germany which privatized their hospitals because they just needed the money. And the more affluent cities in the West, where the more market-oriented parties were governing, usually did not privatize their hospitals.
Yes.
Overall, I do not expect more privatizations. Currently, there is enough money in the market. Local communities seem to have substantial amounts of money to keep their hospitals. And I think it is also a wide understanding that the market separation that we currently have, about a third of the hospitals being publicly owned, so owned by the state when it comes to medical schools, or by local communities, a third being owned by non-for-profit entities, usually church groups, and a third being owned by private for-profit, seems to be quite good share of the market. And I think politically there is not much interest to incentivize that. So there might be another privatization, but I would not really expect privatization of large hospitals, because there is not really seen a political or financial need.
Right. Okay. Fine. Okay. Did you want to add anything, Sharon, to that?
No, I just think I think the point that we're probably all making is that ultimately it comes down to kind of the underlying demands for the healthcare system in that country. You can have whatever political and regulatory change. As for Poland is a very good example. I mean, there's been a huge growth of private healthcare. And I think the same in the UK. If you look at the proportion of private provision across different sectors, it varies vastly. So if we were in the care home sector, almost predominantly,
that's huge.
Private, learning disabilities, community mental health care, again, vast provision of private care, and also purchased on a per patient basis rather than on a kind of on a framework type scale.
So it's almost as though governments, there are certain sectors that it is politically acceptable for a government to retreat from. I mean, it was politically acceptable for Blair to move away from NHS funding of dentistry. So today, 50% in the UK is paid for privately in total, over 50% now, I think. And then there are other sectors, and it's politically acceptable for nursing homes to move into that way. but it's not politically acceptable for hospitals to move in that way. Do you think, in general terms, that there are sectors which politicians are looking at now and saying, I want to retreat from that, or I need to get out of that liability? Joe, what do you think? Or you?
I think you're projecting far too much strategy on political decisions. I think in healthcare, everything is almost all crisis management in terms of for almost any country, really. I mean, Germany's in a fantastic situation where they have massive, money in the system now.
Yes.
So it's really well funded, even with COVID. But other places now, with increasing cost of staff, with all those changes which we're going to go through, it's a lot of pressure is going to build up in the next few years. And then you've got the question about, how does it work with private and public? I think that's what drives more change than any sort of strategy or looking and saying how we should do
So
it.
it's incredibly pragmatic, really.
Yeah, I mean,
Is what you're saying, Sharon, isn't
yeah,
it?
I mean, ultimately, even if the NHS England or the Department of Health did not want to have private provision of mental health or learning disability care, and even though it might be criticised in the press, ultimately there is not the capital funding on top of the already committed, NHS new hospitals to buy out or to provide the facilities for for that care, and so you kind of end up in a tension where we would provide that, but they simply cannot fund or replace those facilities, and those sectors are under extreme staffing pressure.
Yes.
So recruiting into social care, into inpatient or learning disability care, supported living. I mean, those are sectors under extreme pressure, both in terms of kind of wage inflation, recruitment, the impact of Brexit and kind of qualifying issues. I mean, dentistry would be a typical example of the recruitment crisis facing the dentistry industry, impacted by the extreme expense of the exams to become a UK dentist. So you've got all of these kind of tensions,
So
it makes it very difficult.
Do you see a liberalisation in training regimes in Europe happening? I mean, we talked about that in the plenary, didn't we? And about how operators were getting involved in training in a big way. Do you see that as a general trend, that governments are sort of saying, well, we've got to increase the supply of...
I think it's just going to be a necessity.
Yeah.
There's going to be... look at the number of people coming out. Was about 8,500 medical students qualify a year in the UK. You look at Poland. I think it's I can't remember the number that's coming in and the number that are retiring every year. There's just a massive mismatch.
Yeah.
And so AI and this and digital and everything else, but digital, you still need a doctor at the end of the
So are you seeing a change in approach? Are you seeing a move towards massively increasing supply?
I think
you're going to have to have that.
Well, it's going to have to happen. Is it happening?
I don't think it's happening quickly enough.
No,
It's not
I mean,
happening.
there are more general practitioners retiring every year than joining the profession.
Yes.
And that fundamentally, is going to... But I don't think that there has, although people talk about the pressing need to change the training of doctors, I don't believe we've seen it.
You haven't seen those changes?
No.
Yes.
And I think it's interesting because, you try and move to telemedicine and digital health, which of course would alleviate some of that demand, and that in turn brings its own, it's a tiny bit like,
We're not seeing it large enough, and to put in place the infrastructure to actually really have an impact on it, it's just
it's
that's
like
a
a 7
period
to
of
10
time.
year.
And you've got to get the people in, trained, qualified, and everything.
So is this an
it's-
opportunity for the private sector to get involved in training?
Yeah, I think you see that already anyway. Take Poland, for instance, where you have a large increase in terms of the sort of English language-based schooling for medical doctors. Americans, Canadians coming in from all over Europe, coming in and getting qualified there. Hungary, Bulgaria, the same things. So you've sort of got a private sector reaction to it as well. But then you've got a limitation in terms of the number of students they can take through the actual medical on-site training. So then you've got a conflict. Well, okay, our Polish doctors aren't getting qualified, so this increase in foreign doctors coming in is bad. So it's a whole political question. That's going to be the driver in terms of workforce size and workforce supply, and that's going to cause conflicts on the regulatory side.
Yes.
Take Turkey. They use the COVID crisis to say you can't resign from the public system. They introduced, as a COVID reaction, slavery for doctors.
You can't resign from the public
It's
sector.
stopped now, but then they all left. You know, this
Yeah.
is going to be one of the examples of the sort of regulatory short-term destructive reactions that we're going to go
Yeah.
through with the crisis of supply of medical staff.
And I mean, in a sense, there's also the tendency for professions to always want more qualifications, isn't there? I mean, I think, Stefan, in Germany, nursing is still a school leaver. You can still become a nurse from being a school leaver, can't you? Whereas
Yes.
in the UK and many other countries now, you have to go and get a university degree before you become a nurse. Is that going to change in Germany? Are they going to? I mean, it'd be very interesting to see if they actually make it a university subject.
Well, there is some kind of polytechnic education, and we have different levels of nursing, which is also reflected in the salaries, obviously, and is also reflected in the new standards that we have, the new regime for carekeepers in the hospital, but also for nurses in nursing homes.
Yeah.
So it's very diversified. There's not just one position. You have
Okay.
less educated and more educated nurses.
Okay.
But it's
fine.
not a classical university subject as it is in the UK or in the US. That is true.
Okay, fine. Well, I find that we're out of time unless somebody has a question they would love to ask this delicious and lovely panel. Yes, I have a question in the front here. Giuseppe. He's putting on his mask in order to ask the question.
You never know on the mic.
You never know with the mic, that's
So,
true.
a question is, how do you see the impact of the European Recovery Fund on the infrastructure supply, and if this is going to change somehow the balance between private and public operators? Thank you.
What's the impact of the European Recovery Fund
I'll
on?
leave that one to Steph.
Okay, yes. In 2
There you
minutes?
go.
Yes? 3 minutes. Have you got a view on that, Joe?
You know, a lot of this is governed through public decisions in terms of investments for healthcare. So you have now just the announcement now in terms of the European Union funding for pandemic response. I'm sure some of that is going to be channeled into infrastructure for laboratories. I take Poland as an example. The amount of investing in infrastructure for public health laboratories is not very high, let's say, as an example. But this is going to raise the whole awareness of the importance of that type of infrastructure across the whole of Europe. Germany fared well because they have a large infrastructure, because it's privately funded and scalable, but everywhere else it was a pretty much woeful reaction. So I think that's a great thing in terms of raising the awareness of that.
Yes.
And then the other thing is in terms of your ICU bed infrastructure, you know, okay, this is a strategic feature. Yeah, it's not about optimizing your ICU bed
Yes.
structure. So then you need to have some efficiencies in terms of funding for that as well.
Yes. Very quickly, Sharon?
Yeah, I've got nothing. I'll leave it to Stefan to add anything.
Well, I would agree with Jill. For Germany, the European Structure Fund does not have any importance whatsoever currently for German healthcare. And I very much hope that this also will be true in 2 years or later,
Right. Okay.
depending on the new government.
We are
I'm
actually going to be
optimistic that it's going to be.
We are going to be covering that issue actually in the on Wednesday, where we're having a session. We've got somebody from the European Union who's going to be talking about that, and we're going to be looking at how much of that infrastructure fund is available to the private sector. So thanks very much for the question. Okay, fine. Well, it only leaves me to say thank you very much to our panel, and thank you for your time.